Hello, and welcome to both of you. I want to welcome Gilles Libeth and David Zapperstone here with us today to talk with us from Lawyers for Therapists. So welcome both of you. Thanks for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Thank you.
Just to start us off, would you both just share a little bit about you and the mission behind Lawyers for Therapists?
Sure. Where do we start? Well, Lawyers for Therapists really started, I guess you could say, when the stars aligned here in Boston, because David and I, we met when we were in law school, and the very first time we talked, we realized that we had um, a background in social work in common. You know, we both did a MSW. I had got my license before law school. David was working at a group practice, and we were both looking at law school as an avenue to translate or convert our interest in social work and mental health into the legal field. And so we took the 3 years of law school to really shape up the idea little by little. I must say that David had a plan that was well developed, and so we fine tuned it. And once we were done with law school and we passed the bar, we decided to just start the practice out of law school right away. And so, in keeping, if you like, with this original, concept of ours, we view our mission as contributing to the mental health professional community by providing legal support. Broadly speaking, that's how I would phrase it.
Mhm. I love that. I love that two social workers just kind of like found themselves too,
Yeah, no,
right? And
really.
amongst all of that.
Yeah.
Yep, there weren't a ton, and we both had that in common. Yeah, it was our past lives as social workers.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a really neat story that's part of kind of what has developed this business for you both.
Yeah,
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 I love
yeah.
that.
It doesn't
And
exist without that background.
yeah, and so important, right? I mean, we talked about this a little bit, before this video and meeting, and that therapists do like people that get them and understand their needs. And I think,
yep,
and being in that world, right? You both of you kind of understand there are some things
yep.
that are quite niche that we need
Hmm.
lawyers to understand and what we're doing and the risks that are
Yep.
associated with that. And so to really have that lens is so important.
Yeah,
And if anything, they don't have to explain all the acronyms to us. We
Yeah.
know
Oh,
your
yes.
EHR, your NPI, we know your acronyms, so you don't have to
That's
waste
right.
time
And you
explaining
have
it.
your own now, your other.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I love that. So, so kind of jumping in then, I'm curious to know, we'll kind of like start a little bit more broad and then go down a little bit more, but what do you see, and even from your own perspectives as former therapists or, merging into this world, what do you see as common gaps or oversights that therapists that when they're setting up their practice or they are in practice that they're missing when it comes
Yeah.
to the legal side?
yeah,
Yeah. I think that, you know, in grad school, you're not taught the business side. You're not taught generally. I don't know of any programs that teach you how to run a private practice, what that's like. You do get a lot, or you get some um, into the ethics, the code of ethics, sort of how you're supposed to conduct yourself as a profession. But licensed therapists is a heavily regulated area. There's a
Mhm.
lot of laws, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of regulations, and they not only vary from state to state, but they vary by license type. And so I think
Right.
we have this group of people who have honed their clinical skills, learned different modalities and all these things, and they're you know, they're doing the work and they're great at it.
Mhm.
And they sometimes don't realize I'm in this very regulated profession, right? And so an example, we look at intake forms. Um, EHRs will have templates
Yeah, very
and
basic.
very basic templates. And I think that's starting out a private practice. I think that's one of the common mistakes I see is that we see is, this template is fine. I'm just going to use it and
Mhm.
maybe tweak some language here and there, but there are some very specific um, parts of the intake paperwork that's required by various state laws to be in there, and it
Mm.
ultimately will protect the therapist.
Yeah, that's
And
such a
Jill,
great point. That is such a great point that, just to think about, are you licensed in different states, or just what are the rules, right? And you're supposed to go with kind of the most stringent too,
hmm
but are you considering this or just using a basic template?
exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Oh gosh. Yeah. I came from community mental health where it was like all the rules, right? So then
Exactly.
like, do we need to dial this back a little bit? But it's a little bit different. I'm
Yeah.
as you talk to, I think, gosh, how much did you go back to what you learned in school after completing, law school to think about all the holes too, all the
Oh
things
yeah.
you guys weren't taught.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the thing too is we've gotten some feedback like the legal what we can do is create intake forms that are both legally compliant, but also give room for the therapists to add their own language for accessibility and things that matter to therapists, right? And to make it clear for the clients to understand, not complete legal jargon and, stuff that doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
Balance. Yeah.
Balance. Yeah. Yep. How to have protection and don't be creating so much within your own work and paperwork for clients that
Yeah.
daunting too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I'm curious to know kind of other examples too of
Yeah.
areas where maybe therapists underestimate something that could be a bigger problem later. One of the things that, for an example that I think of is like that I learned a little bit late and after the fact was, I had my malpractice insurance, but then when you get the business, you don't think about, oh gosh, you have to cover the business too. And like, what does that look like? And I was like, oh crap.
hmm
But what are those other things? Because down the road, right, that could be a problem.
That's
Yeah.
right. Well, you're right to point out that particular issue because what's at stake there is uh, the need to understand the terms of a contract, not necessarily in a like an expert legal sense,
Mm-hmm.
but getting an idea of the implications of a contract, for instance, a malpractice insurance policy. What are the implications of this, agreement for my practical, conduct,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's something that often people don't pay sufficient attention to because we think in the case of the insurance policy, well, I have insurance, okay, so I'm fine,
Mm-hmm.
but there are um, details that sure you may need a lawyer to explain to you in a very poised and expert-like manner, but that you can also kind of have a broad understanding of just to guide your day to day. So that's one issue, like awareness of what a contract will bind you to.
Yeah, which I think with malpractice insurance, for example, till you pay for it, you don't always see it.
Yeah.
right? Or it's not, you get some of it, but you don't get the detail of what all of that is until after. And then you're like, okay,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
Not always. And and generally speaking, you don't want. And I think that's a general posture that David and I we will have as we discuss these issues together, is that it pays off to be aware of what you're getting yourself into in order to spot the potential problem and have an idea of about how your day-to-day conduct can be influenced by you know contracts, by obligations, and all that type of stuff.
Yeah. And I think, one thing you mentioned, other common mistakes we see, and we see it a little bit more out here in the East Coast, but it could have, applies anywhere. If you're practicing, if you're collecting revenue from clients in various states,
Mm,
if you're licensed in other states, if you're collecting revenue from those states, you need to have an analysis done of, do you need to pay taxes in those states? Do you need to register as a foreign entity in those states? And what are the penalties for not doing so?
yeah, that's a great point. I am seeing that more and more, especially with the compacts out there,
Hmm.
right, across states, and people getting licensed in more states and not knowing that that's a thing. Are they being licensed in a state that doesn't have that doesn't have like a state tax or not,
Right, right.
kinds of things that they don't think about.
Yep,
Yep.
exactly.
Yep. And ignorance may be bliss, but it doesn't get you far when you get in trouble.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's a little bit more work up front to make sure that your ducks are in a row, but we can tell you from the experience of our clients, it can save you quite a headache
Yeah.
down the line.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great. That's a great point for people to think about. Oh my gosh, what am I doing with this?
Yep.
I need to pay attention to that. What about in terms of, a lot, especially since COVID, some of us were online doing telehealth way before that, but what about regarding an online presence and websites and things like that, right? Because now there's Google reviews and there's all sorts of
Hmm.
conversation about ethics around that, and also HIPAA, right? And
Hmm.
just even legal protections for websites and just having an online presence.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about those kinds of things?
Yeah, yeah. I think, one thing you mentioned is the Google reviews and the protected health information, and it's huge because even inadvertently, someone could piece together something that you say online and identify a client, which is of
Yeah,
course bad. Um, I think, every state has different ethics, and every on online reviews, and every license type has different codes, ethics from their codes of how they want the clinicians to handle those things. Um, from a legal perspective, you know, best be safe, better safe than sorry. Don't respond to reviews, because even that
yeah,
acknowledges a patient-client relationship, right?
yeah, yeah. I've heard
Um,
I've heard if you do, you make it really blanket around like our practice, whatever. But that's the stance I took. And it wasn't a client that did it, but still I was like, say nothing.
yeah, exactly. It's tricky because yes, there are, and in our profession too, there are rules about how we're supposed to respond to that kind of stuff, and
Mhm.
it's nuanced and it's tricky. I think one of the things I've seen is on website privacy policies, especially in this field, because you may be collecting name, maybe you're collecting a birthday to run insurance, maybe you're collecting, presenting problem. That's a whole bunch of protected health information. And if it's, you want to make sure it's clearly laid out in your privacy policy, what you're doing with this information, who you're sharing it with, and what happens to it in the event this person never becomes a client.
Yep. And that's a great point too, right? Because so many therapists start out and build their own pages.
Yep.
And unless you've got some awareness around that, you don't know that you need to have, the privacy policy in terms of things like that you can get free, and
Yeah.
mess with easily
Yep.
to do that. But most people don't think about that.
Right. Yeah, and then there's the making sure that if you're, especially for clinicians who specialize working with teens or adolescent, younger people,
Yeah.
making sure that there's disclaimers about the website not being for a certain age, and if it is,
Mm.
then really dive deep into how you're using that data.
Yeah. You both remind me so much of, like, it takes me back to, what they drilled in your ethics class, right? Of like, pay attention to your ethics paperwork, the books, right? Get back into that and really, like, what is the most
Yeah,
stringent, and pay attention to that and remember that and use that as your rules. And I think sometimes I think there is a risk, though, the more you've been in the field, to just like we're driving on the road, you lose a little sense of that and need
yeah,
to kind of get back and get fresh with what, because it changes too, right? Like,
totally.
what does it say for LPC right now? Or,
Yep.
that may have changed from 15 years ago or
And
whatever.
I think therapists would be surprised how much of the law they already know by looking at their ethics, right? Because a lot of
Right.
statutes and regulations incorporate ethical codes. There's more to it, but it's a guidepost for therapists. So review your ethics. You may already know a lot more of the law than you think by doing that.
Right, go back to it, remind
Yeah.
fresh, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Jill, anything to add on that?
I No, I think on this, on this issue of, disseminating potentially potential client identification, it's a big deal, and it does require some thinking, some planning,
Mhm.
right? And as David mentioned, knowing the ethics that are specific to your license, that's important. And
Yeah.
in certain cases, there are rules that are common to all mental health professionals. Um, Having an idea of what those are too can prove useful. And you're right. As we develop expertise, we may tend to just, give ourselves a little more leeway and be just a little complacent. Um, there's nothing wrong with that per se, because you develop your own style,
Mhm.
your own practices. But it's important to also remember where the boundaries are.
Yep,
Yeah.
100%. Yep, that's great. Okay. So I'm curious to know, just kind of segueing a little more specific. A lot of times I'm seeing posts around about therapists who want to grow into maybe a group practice, um, and just this idea of bringing someone on and things that they might need to think about that, right? Because there's always this contractor versus and 1099 versus
Yeah.
employee and all of these different things. And so what are some considerations around that therapists
Yeah.
should know?
Yeah, that's an important area as well. Uh, I guess a lot of people want to, use the independent contractor framework, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, More flexible. There, you don't have to pay some of the taxes that you have to pay when you have an employee, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if the relationship is not a true independent contractor relationship, then the practice owner um, opens himself or herself to risks and
Yeah.
and penalty as well.
Yeah.
And it is important to know that just because the contract that you have states that the other party is an independent contractor, right? Doesn't mean that this is the end of, the consideration, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's important to bear in mind how crucial the conduct of the parties can be, how the two people relate to their respective roles, how they how the compensation goes, right?
Hmm.
Without realizing it, in how the persons conduct their business, the practice owner may slip into employer territory rather than just independent contractor relationship. So to that, I'd say yes, it is important to understand the contract. I think I made that point earlier. But also have the people who drafted the contract, and I guess that would be a lawyer, have that person educate you on how your performance of what the performance of the contract looks like,
Yeah.
right? It says that it may say that the person is an independent contractor, but what does it mean exactly in terms of how you relate to that person?
Mm-hmm.
And a crucial part, regardless of the jurisdiction, a crucial part of this is that the principal must not exercise control over the means of performance of the independent contractor, right? That's one important thing. So something to pay attention.
Yeah.
So okay, get a lawyer to draft your contract that is geared towards an independent contractor, but have that lawyer sit down with you and explain, okay, it means that in this situation, you should do this and be careful not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then that should do the trick.
And one of the reasons it's so important is because I mean, independent contractor classification laws, they can protect workers, right? They can give workers rights, but state governments have a huge interest in enforcing these laws because they're losing money when people are classified as independent contractors. They're not getting payroll taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And so the states are pretty tough on businesses when it comes to misclassifying workers.
They're auditing.
They're auditing, they're checking, they're taking complaints, and
Mm-hmm.
it can be hefty fines. Every state has a different statutory framework of how much money a company can be liable for violating this, and every state has different um, factors to consider when it comes to determining is this person a contractor or are they an employee? And that's why I think there's so much discussion around it because the consequences can be pretty severe, um, and it's risky without the proper guidance.
Yeah, I think there's some major um businesses out there that are getting in trouble for that right now, right? That
Oh yeah,
are they 1099s? Are they employees? So I mean that's important. I love the distinction that you both make that because it is a different lane, right? And how like even paperwork you give is going to be different, right? Like if they're employee, they're gonna have there's
hmm
like an employee manual and things like that, and like you need to know the differences, and unless you've even like worked in a field or had experience in your job to know some of those, like I think a lot of therapists just go, oh, I want to have a group practice, and they're thinking
yep,
about it from a different aspect and they're not realizing all that's tied into it legally.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of requirements when it comes to hiring, notices that have to be given, and it's easier to just hire contractors.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier. I get it, but it might not be a valid arrangement.
And you can help talk those through too on both sides, what would be better.
Absolutely, and we've even helped clients that they say, "Hey, I really want to have an independent contractor relationship," and we'll dig deep and say how if can we make it work? Maybe you got to tweak this, you got to tweak that, you got to pay them this way, you got to set it up that way, and maybe you can make it work. But in Massachusetts and California, some states, for example, it's just really tough.
Mm-hmm.
They're very strict.
Okay. I love this. What about when it comes to naming your business? I know when I went to school, there was I don't know, some professors that really would kind of push not to use your name because, more liability with that. But then also from a branding marketing perspective, some will say have your name out there and things under your name looks really good too. And I think this could be a legal conversation that goes on a long way, depending on what you're what you're trying to do with your name. But I'm curious to know thoughts around that, because you see a lot of therapists that it's, Jane Doe therapy.
Mm-hmm. It's tough to say on the legal considerations here. I think if you have a legal entity, an LLC, a corporation, something like that, your level of protection is going to be the same from a legal standpoint, regardless of what you name it in terms of
Okay.
liabilities, right? Um,
There's a
I
but.
think but I think it's more of a like you said, a marketing question, a personal preference question. Do you feel comfortable having your name out there,
Hmm.
right? And then you wouldn't with a practice name that you've made up or that you've chosen that's not your name, you have the potential to protect that through trademark. Whereas with your name, that's not as simple.
Yeah, you don't help with trademarks too, do you?
We do.
Shut
Dude,
up. I have trademarks I need to talk to you about, and that's something.
All right. We definitely do trademarks. Yeah, those
That's
are fun.
cool.
And yeah, so that's, we can trademark slogans, practice names, logos, things like that.
logos.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, we're gonna get into that in a little bit of all the
Okay.
different things, because I'm already like, ooh, do you do this and do you do that? I'm already like, as you both are sharing. So I'm so curious. Okay, this one is a big one, um, and it's something that we never want to think about as therapists, right? In terms of complaints or lawsuits, fortunately, they happen. And even if there's the threat of one, right? We've got our malpractice insurance, but also, they're protecting themselves too, to some degree.
Hmm.
And there's things that we don't know about as therapists on how that goes. And the whole process can be quite daunting. And I'm curious to know thoughts on, hiring, like when we would know maybe that we need to seek additional counsel around that, whether it goes into, battle or not, but just like what could you share with us on that? Because that's a scary situation.
Yeah.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Well, I'll take this one. Now, the first part of what I want to say um, applies to before there is even a hint of trouble.
Okay, I like
Um,
that.
a consistent dedication to best practice goes a
Mhm.
long way. And one aspect of that is documenting what you do.
Yes.
Right? If you have a practice of documenting important things about, your practice or your business in general, that can help because complaints to the board or lawsuits or any form of proceeding um, often boils down to what evidence is out there,
Hmm.
right? And if you don't have if you don't have like a consistent practice of documenting things, you may be relying on memory. And if you're called on to testify on something, then you may be truthful, but your credibility may be questioned at the time. But if you have documentation on several aspects of your practice, that will help. So that's before we even think about something going wrong and there being trouble. Now, A couple of things to remember. When you realize that there may be an issue, your first instinct may be to discuss it with several people. This happened to me with this client, or this happened to me with this contractor. Do you know anything about that? And then you talk to one person. You're not satisfied with that, the response you're getting, and you're not sure really of its value because you didn't talk to a lawyer. You just talked to someone who you think, has the common sense to give you an opinion.
Mhm.
Before you know it, you have spread information about your situation to multiple people, and your accounts may differ in small ways or in big ways, but that's an issue. That's going to be an issue for later. So here, what I would say, don't talk to a bunch of people
Mhm.
if you got a problem. Talk to someone who you know is held to a duty of confidentiality. Talk to someone who can break down the mess that you kind of identify but you're not sure about,
Mhm.
and turn this thing into a clear understanding of your potential liability. I'm saying this because the person I have in mind is a lawyer, right? But the main point here is, you know, keep your problem to yourself. Don't vent. If you
Mhm.
got a problem and you want to talk about it, fine. But make sure that talking about it is actually a step towards identifying the problems and maybe solving the problem.
Mhm.
So, another problem. There's an issue with a third party. Don't try to reach out to that person if you know that it's not going to be it's not going to resolve the situation.
Mhm.
So what that will do is just further inflame whatever situation you've got going. Open yourself up for maybe a claim of harassment of some nature, right?
Yeah, you don't want to make it worse.
You don't want to make it worse. That's another thing. More generally speaking, don't let emotions take over. You know, you freak out. And I'm not saying it's easy to do, right?
Mhm.
Freak out, you got a big problem. Oh my God, it's a mess, right? So you may just do something, respond, refrain from doing that.
Mhm.
All right, that's another one. Another thing, and it involves lawyers. Sometimes you're in trouble with someone. It could be a client, it could be someone you've worked with, and that person just is maybe a step ahead of you and will talk to a lawyer. And you get a letter from a lawyer, very aggressive, that says, you've got to give me this and that document, right?
Mhm.
Just because a lawyer from the other side asks you to give something doesn't mean you have to give it to
That's a good point.
them, right? They so these are the things that come to mind, but I think the overall stance um, is to talk to talk to an attorney that can help you even just identify what it is that you're dealing with.
Mhm.
And who knows, maybe there's no real trouble,
Yeah.
right? But at
So
least
even at the beginning, you would suggest even having a malpractice insurance to come and consult with you just to talk through it and know. Yeah.
Yeah.
and we've mentioned it earlier. It's important to know the terms of your malpractice insurance.
Mm-hmm.
The malpractice insurance may provide coverage for a claim,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily for a proceeding, right? So what the insurance company may say there is that, well, if there's a claim against you, we are going to try to settle this. Now, if you, the policy holder, you don't want to settle,
Right.
then you're on your own, because some of these policies leave it to the discretion of the insurer, of the insurance company.
Right. So if they settle anyway,
If they settle, then yeah,
my understanding is if they settle, you can get a hit on you. They have to report it to like Dora for Colorado, for example. So if they were to do something like that, even though they settled and like you looked good on paper and you were doing everything regardless or whatever the situation, is that something that you all could help deal with and fight? Like, is there a way to fight that?
or a recourse, you mean,
Yeah,
when
if they were gonna settle and they had and there's a state requirement or some sort of requirement that a settlement has to be reported to the licensing body, right? Or the regulatory agency. Is that something that you all can help too with your services?
well, we would certainly want to take a look at a case like this.
Okay. So there's some movement possibly with that to be able to.
We definitely could look at it, because what this obligation to report
Mm-hmm.
the settlement, how does it fit within what the the board or the regulatory authority, how does the settlement fit into its own requirements for you, the practitioner? I'd like to take a look at the claim,
Yeah.
the regulations that you are bound by, and see if there's any, if you have any room or any recourse there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what are the terms of, again, goes back to what are the terms of the policy agreement? And is there something in there that isn't enforceable or isn't valid?
Mm-hmm.
Contracts are challenged all the time.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. That's so good to know because I feel like I think just as a human in
Yeah.
general, like you think of contracts, right? That they're enforceable and you feel like there's this level of I don't know, power that you don't
Yeah,
have. There's a power dynamic that's in play, right? And so
absolutely.
you forget that you maybe do have the power to argue some of these or fight some of these things.
Yeah. And if you get contracts from anywhere, it could be let's say it's kind of veering off now, but if
Yeah.
you have a contract with a new, I don't know, an HR company or a payroll software company or any kind of contract, and you want to negotiate the terms, ask them to negotiate the terms, look over
Yeah.
the contract, see if the terms work for you. If they're requiring an unreasonable amount of notice to cancel or all of these things, is stuff you can negotiate or you can try.
Yes, you can even help with that when people are trying to get
Yeah.
Evaluated, that's for sure. It's the
all the
first step.
lists. Okay. So, I mean, what would you say? I mean, you touched on some of these in terms of, that the benefits, right, of being able to meet with you all. How would a therapist really know it's good time to seek some legal support? So maybe
Yeah.
milestones, red flags, like
Yep.
vision points, things like that.
I think as we kind of touched on, it doesn't seem intuitive, but right when you start
Yeah.
is probably a good idea. Like we said, to make sure that your forms are all in order, you're legally set up correctly how you want to be, and just to avoid, we can ask a bunch of questions so we can make sure that you're not going to be scrambling and spending a lot more money later on. So I think initial startup is important. We also touched on, I would say, your first hire,
Mm-hmm.
um,
For
whether it's
sure.
an
Both of those
yeah,
are big ones.
whether it's a contractor, even if you're well, especially I guess any kind of person you hire, if you hire a biller or someone who's not like a staff member, but who's going to have access to your protected health information,
Mm,
there's agreements you got to have in place there.
yeah.
So anyone you hire, um, if there's a complaint, you become aware of a complaint against your license. Um, Gilles, anything else?
If
Big,
you are contemplating multi-state practice,
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a big one. You know,
Good.
today you're confined to Colorado and you're pretty confident in what you're doing. Um, but you're thinking, hey, I may want to, start, taking client from that other state in which I'm licensed,
yep,
right? Um, more opportunity for sure, but also more legal considerations to be aware of.
yeah. And you want to make sure too, speaking of insurance, that your policy doesn't have any geographical limitations, right? It says it will only cover you in certain areas.
Right. Right. To make sure of that,
Yeah.
especially with as many therapists now that want to move abroad,
Yep.
or clients too that are, and what are the the rules in different states or countries too, right? Can vary
Right.
whether you
Right.
can practice or not.
Uh, there, there, there. We are aware that there is some concern, for example, uh, for therapists who participate in the provision of gender affirming care.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that some states not only ban it on their territory, but also try to prosecute or at least reach,
Mm-hmm.
practitioners and
Mm.
professionals from other states who, who do it. Um, it's important to know exactly what your state provides and to what extent your out of state practice
Mm-hmm.
could put you in jeopardy.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a great point. That is so true. All these things to consider.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. What would be other services that you would offer, to therapists that would be really important to note? And what would it look like to work with you?
Yeah. Well, like briefly mentioned, we can do trademark and copyright applications and enforcement. Trying to think of some other not so commonly thought of services.
I have a couple I can throw at you and you can say yes or no.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
so a lot of times, well, I know you would with like a CPA, but would you have any part of the discussion on if someone was going to go trying to figure out going S corp or not in terms of paperwork and laws and things like that?
There's one form that a lot of CPAs um, recommend an attorney look at when filing an S corp, and we can certainly look at that kind of in conjunction with the CPA.
What
Um,
about non-competes or things like that when people are trying to move from group practices
yeah,
into private practice, things
yeah,
like that?
certainly. Those
Yeah.
are huge. We do a
Yeah.
lot with non-competes and the very subtle differences between non-competes and non-solicitations,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how they're enforceable in what contexts and in what states. So, uh,
Oh, there's a difference. Okay. Of
yes,
course there is.
of course.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
not.
yeah,
So yeah, absolutely. We work a lot with those kinds of provisions. I
yeah.
guess another thing would be general like waivers of liability for things like nature walks or walk and talk or therapy, maybe that's really somatic and that has movement,
Mm-hmm.
especially with children. Can guardians sign for waivers of liability? In some states, yes, in some states, no. So all of that kind of stuff. There's some inherent risks with doing therapy in public. Even if people
Mm-hmm.
can't hear you, you're still being seen. You're in
Right.
you're in public. So informed consent and releases and waivers are huge in all those extra sort of areas.
So making sure that they have that and that they say the things that they need within those
Exactly.
given modalities that they're working in.
Yep. And that whatever they give to the client to sign is enforceable. Again, does it meet all the requirements that your state's courts would enforce as valid if this were to ever become a problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything you would add to that?
No, I'm very impressed by David. Yeah, well, there's something that we do offer, gladly. There are therapists who have been in practice for a while and who've developed their practice, through sheer sense of organization and discipline, but may just want to have an audit, conducted on their practice, just to make sure that, all my forms that I've been using for a while that, never got me into trouble. You know, we can take a look at those forms, your policies, and then give you an evaluation.
Yeah.
I would imagine that would come into play also if you wanted to sell your practice too, right?
Absolutely.
Like that you would need to
Yep.
involve you.
Oh, and we also do we can only do them right now in Massachusetts, but professional wills.
Oh, that was the other
or
thing I was gonna ask.
yeah, there's that's what they're commonly known as. We're pressed to find an actual legal term for them other than just wills, but they operate separately, or they can operate separately from a personal will. So we have done that as well.
Okay, awesome. That's
Yeah.
great. Anything else that you would add in terms of, based off of the things you've shared so much, but any other things that you would add that you would want therapists to know if they were opening their doors tomorrow?
That Lawyers for Therapists is around.
I love it.
Now we're very
Yeah.
fun, easy to work with. I know consulting with a lawyer can feel a certain way. And we, the feedback that we get, and our main goal is to try and make therapists feel comfortable. We work with you, we're
Yeah.
very flexible, and open and honest about, what we can do, what we can't do. We try, I might regret saying this, but we try very much to keep billable hours as low as possible. We want to work with folks, we understand that the legal services has historically been a pretty unaccessible field, and we don't want it to be like that for therapists.
Yeah.
The way we look at it is, resorting to legal advice does not have to be like an extraordinary measure that you come to only when you're in big trouble, right?
Yeah.
You can reach out for guidance.
Preventative care.
Exactly.
So that's the spirit.
Right.
Yep.
And we there to provide that guidance on compliance issues, and this discreet advice, even ahead of any potential trouble. I think it goes a long way in providing people with clarity, and also just get rid of that feeling of uncertainty and feeling overwhelmed that comes with everything that
the social work skills coming into play help us feel comfortable. Yeah. Because we all come in with our own bias, right? Even about like what it would be like working with a lawyer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I appreciate you both taking the time to meet with me and time out of your day and sharing your wisdom. And just to leave off this here, what what would be the way to learn about you, find you? I mean, we'll post it with this, but how can viewers go about setting up consultations and working with you?
Yeah, we offer free 30-minute consultations that can be you can request that on our
Really?
website. Yeah, you can
That's
request
really
it on our
huge in lawyer world.
okay. Well, good. We offer that. You can reach out on the website, lawyersfortherapists.com. Our email is on there, phone numbers. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook as well, and we're around. So
We're
yeah.
around. For now, we are operating in Massachusetts, in Colorado, California. Very soon we expect to extend, spread our wings to Connecticut.
Okay.
And after that, the next frontier will be New York State. So,
Okay.
we're working to be accessible to more and more people as time goes by.
Great. Thank you
And
for
our
doing that.
and our website has a resources page with things that will some bigger projects this summer that we'll be doing for folks to be able to get some free guidance on if they have questions. So that page is there now. It's got some blogs and some ideas, but it will be added to a lot this summer for sure.
Great. We'll keep an eye out for that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Well, those of you who watched through the end, there was a lot of good stuff in here and a lot of insight that was shared. So comment below any thoughts and that you had during the interview, any additional videos that you want to see. Have a great day and a thriving practice.